Okay, good morning, brothers and sisters in the Dharma. I'm happy to be back again. And this morning, the topic is the Sublime Eightfold Way. Basically, this is what most of you know of as the Noble Eightfold Path. But my teacher, Venerable Dr. Punaji, he prefers to translate it more precisely to mean the Sublime Eightfold Way. I think most of you would be very familiar with the traditional interpretation and traditional explanation about the Eightfold Path, so I'm not going to do it in the traditional way. So today's sharing is a very unique and special one. I'm going to do it in a very modern and scientific way to explain in a very modern and scientific way what is this Sublime Eightfold Way. That's why I call this a psychological perspective, because we're going to use psychology to explain about the teachings of the Buddha. Actually, this is the first in a series, so I hope to come back to continue with the series. So this is just the introduction to the Eightfold Way. We begin by basically taking a look at what did the Buddha teach. If we were to ask ourselves, what exactly did the Buddha teach? Of course, we can go into a very long discussion about the Four Noble Truths, about the Eightfold Way, and then go into a long discussion. But fortunately, the Buddha left behind a very useful saying in the Dhammapada, where he summarized it in a very simple way, and it is very meaningful. He basically pointed out that we should abandon all evil ways, we should enter the good life, and we should purify one's mind. And basically, this is the teaching of all the Buddhas. Now here, he used the word plural, Buddhas. Basically, he was also explaining his own learning from his past life, from the previous Buddhas that had come along. Thank you, brother. Yeah, very good. That's why I like coming here. I'm always pampered with all these wonderful things. Okay, good. Now, one of the important things is to understand some of the translated words. So I'm going to be very precise with some of the words. Like when we say this is the teachings of the Buddha, so we call the teachings of the Buddha Dharma. Now, very often the word Dharma, what is the English translation of the word Dharma? Many of us would have heard the translation of the word truth. So people are saying, oh, Buddha is teaching the truth. Okay, we could say that what Buddha taught is indeed the truth, but we can't point to something and say, oh, this is the truth, and say the Buddha Dharma is religion of the truth. Because when you say something is the truth, then what else are you saying? You are also saying that other things which is not the same as that must be false. Because when you say something is the truth, then something else that is not the same as it must be false. Actually, the word Dharma does not really mean truth from the teachings of the Buddha. Because in Pali, as my teacher explained to me, the word Dharma really means experience. So what did the Buddha teach? The Buddha taught experiential realities. What was the reality that he had experienced? First as a prince, later as a Buddha. And then that is what he has taught. So basically, let's take a look at the experience of the Buddha and how he came to teach the Dharma using the Sublime Eightfold Way. So we begin by basically looking back at the days when he was a prince. As a prince, he was living in this luxurious palace, surrounded by young people, beautiful women, good food, and strong servants to do anything he wanted. So he was surrounded by a lot of luxurious things, and he indulged in all that. So he was surrounded by all kinds of sensual pleasures. But indulging in sensual pleasure is a very common human activity. I mean, all of us do that. We cannot say that we don't do that. Perhaps when we renounce and become monks and go into homelessness, then of course we will then be spared from the indulgence into these sensual pleasures. But if we look around without being judgmental, we look around, we also see a lot of monastics are also in some ways, small or big ways, also indulging in some of the pleasures. But maybe not by choice. We are the people who spoil them. We do a lot of things to spoil them. We feed them with the best food. We never give them, simple food. Only the monks who go on alms round, perhaps, they would be getting the most simple food. But the rest of us, during Katina, during all kinds of dana, we give them the best of everything. So we are the ones responsible for spoiling them. So Prince Siddhartha was surrounded by all these wonderful things, and he was indulging in these sensual pleasures. Then he started to realize that this may not be what is the reality, because he realized that there's something missing in his life. So he started to leave the palace in the evening to go out and see the real world. So from time to time he left the palace and went out. And during these excursions away from the palace, he started to see some realities of life. He started to come across what is known today as the 4 great signs. One of the first things he saw was an old man. Then he started to realize, now there are no old men in the palace, but now there are these old men out there. Then he realized that people do get old. Aging is part and parcel of living. And in another excursion, he also came across a sick man. Then he realized, people do get sick. Not everyone lives in the luxury of good health forever. So people do get sick. They get old, they get sick. And then on another excursion, he came across a dead corpse that was about to be put into a funeral. And then he realized, people do die. So these were the signs that woke him up from the dream, and he started to realize something must be missing in his life. And finally, he came across a monk or a renunciate, someone who has shaven his head and gone into homelessness. And he asked the monk what he was doing, and the monk basically was explaining that he was cultivating to become enlightened. Then he realized that there is something that he could do with his own life. He knew that something was missing. He knew that there were big problems to be solved. So he realized, since the beginning of time, since the dawn of civilization, the greatest problem to be solved by humanity, by mankind, is this problem of existence. The problem we all know of as birth, aging, sickness, and death. He realized that he needed to find a solution. So he decided to shave his head and renounce and become homeless and leave the palace. To him, this was his way of searching for the solution. And he decided that it is a solution that he has to search in his own ways. So he was in search of a humanistic solution, a solution that only human beings can discover. He was not dependent on belief in God and blind faith. He did not subscribe to those things. He realized that he had to find the solution himself. So he was in search of a humanistic solution. So he went to 2 teachers. But those 2 teachers could not really teach him how to become enlightened, because they themselves were not enlightened teachers. So he realized that, and then he went into a special practice with 5 of his friends, asceticism, thinking that at one time in his life he was indulging in sensual pleasures. Now he wants to break away from that. He wants to restrain himself from these sensual pleasures. And the way was to practice asceticism. So he practiced asceticism, where he started to stop eating, stop drinking. And it was when he wanted to stop breathing, then he fainted, because no one could really stop breathing. So he fainted and almost died. But from there, he was rescued, and then he realized that there is a better way. And the better way is to practice on his own a proper, harmonious way to awaken himself. So he decided to meditate under the Bodhi tree. and he became awakened. And from that awakening, he started to teach. At first, he was reluctant to teach, but eventually he realized that he had to share this reality, this experience that he had. So he was really going to share this experience. And he came across his 5 ascetic friends. And now he started to give his first sermon. That very first sermon was the sermon where he set into motion the wheel of the Dharma. It was the very famous Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. That is his very first sermon. And basically his sermon was expounding on this Sublime Eightfold Way. But he didn't go straight into this Sublime Eightfold Way. He did not go straight into this solution. He first explained to his friends that there are things to be avoided, extremities to be avoided. He pointed out that there are 2 extremes that we should all avoid. The first extreme is that we get emotionally aroused by things happening around us, and we get excited. We get emotionally excited, and we want to release this tension in action. And we do that by indulging in these sensual pleasures. Things that are pleasurable to us, we want to have more of it. Things that are painful to us, we want to get rid of it. So he pointed out that as a young prince, that's what he did, indulging in sensual pleasures. And he also pointed out to his 5 ascetic friends that practicing asceticism was also not the solution, because you were tormenting yourself. It's self-torment, self-mortification, trying to suppress and withhold all emotional urges. And he said that is also not the way. There is a middle way. Because the first part, indulging in sensual pleasures, is indulgence. And indulgence is one extreme. We get excited and we do things because of this excitement. That is indulgence. The other thing is, when we get excited, we hold everything and suppress everything. That is restraint. So these are the 2 extremes to be avoided. And then he went on to say that there is a middle way. And what is that middle way? Basically, when our senses are stimulated by by environmental activities, and we get emotionally excited, what should we do? When we get emotionally excited, the first thing we should learn is conscious relaxation. Just relax ourselves. Don't get excited by the emotional urges and then start to react according to it. Just calm down and relax, and then bring your attention introspective attention. Focus your attention inwards. And this process of bringing your attention inwards is actually part and parcel of the meditation process. And the method that he taught there was the Satipatthana, how to bring this attention inwards. And of course, people translate Satipatthana as mindfulness, but it's a little bit deeper than just the word mindfulness. It's introspective attention, bringing the attention inwards. And then when we do that, we will begin to see what is going on in the body, in our feelings, in our emotional states, and in the way we interpret our circumstances. And when we're able to see that, then we're able to understand what is really happening. And then we can cultivate mental equilibrium. And he actually explained further that this can be accomplished with what he now calls, or what we all know as the Noble Eightfold Path, the Sublime Eightfold Way. Now, my teacher calls this the Sublime Eightfold Way because it comes from the word Arya Magga. Arya actually is not noble. Arya is beyond normal, beyond the normal being. So it's super normal. We could say it is super normal Eightfold Way. Now, there's a difference between the way and the path. So if you think of it, the path is like the road. You look at the road. If you want to go to Penang, you go on the northbound road and you head towards Penang. The road is the path. So you follow the road and you will get there. That is the path. But what is the way? The way is actually the way we take the journey. So it's not just about the road anymore. It is the road and how we travel along the journey on this road. So how we cultivate ourselves. So the way is really not about the path, not about the road, but about the way we cultivate ourselves, how we practice. The practice is more important than the path. So it's not really about the path. It is really about the way we practice the path. So Sublime Eightfold Way is about how we practice this Eightfold Way. So basically he taught them this Eightfold Way. Right? And these two extremes he pointed out, the pursuit of sensual happiness from sensual pleasures is low, vulgar, the way of ignorant beings, ignoble, and unbeneficial. That means if we begin to indulge in sensual pleasures to seek happiness, that is really not the long-term solution, not the good solution. And then the other extreme, the pursuit of self-mortification, self-restraint, and asceticism, basically. This is painful. Again, it is ignoble and it is unbeneficial. Without veering towards either of these extremes, the Tathagata has awakened to the middle way, which gives rise to vision, gives rise to knowledge, leads to peace, leads to direct knowledge, to enlightenment, to Nibbana. He calls himself the Tathagata. Basically, the Tathagata is the one who is awakened. And he pointed out that this is the middle way, and it gives rise to vision. Vision means the ability to see the reality for yourself, the ability to see what is real and what is not real, what is good and what is not good. And then that leads to knowledge. And from there it leads to peace, tranquility of mind, mental equilibrium. And then we begin to gain the true knowledge, again the insight, panya, the true knowledge of the ultimate realities. And that is direct knowledge. And from that direct knowledge, panya, it leads to awakening, to enlightenment, vimutti. So it leads to this enlightenment, which is called Nibbana, the awakening. So he pointed out that is the solution. And there is the Eightfold Way. So he went on to explain how it all comes together as the Four Noble Truths. And he began by pointing out that there are these Four Noble Truths. The first is that there is suffering, and then there is the origin of suffering, there is the end to suffering, and the way leading to the end or the cessation of suffering is the Eightfold Way. So the first noble truth is basically that it's all about dukkha, that there is suffering. And he pointed out, what is dukkha then? This is the noble truth of suffering, where birth is suffering, aging is suffering, illness is suffering, and death is suffering. And then he went on to explain further. What else is suffering? Suffering is to be with what is not pleasurable, what is painful and displeasing. When we are with things that we don't want, that is suffering. And another kind of suffering is things that we have always enjoyed, what is pleasing to us, to be separated from them, to be away from what we find to be pleasurable in life. That is suffering. To be without what we used to enjoy. And then to desire for something and not get it. Not to get what one desires for, what wants. That is suffering. And finally, all we are is basically these five aggregates going on in the body. And these five aggregates leads to our experience as a human being. And it is this five aggregates arising that gives rise to this experience as a living human being. We cling on to this experience. That is suffering. Clinging on to this experience as a human being, experiencing all kinds of things around us. Clinging on to these five aggregates. That is suffering. So basically, this is the first noble truth of what the Buddha pointed out, that there is suffering. And then basically, it's very important to understand, human beings, we are the only species of animal that regrets the past, is fearful of the future, and never satisfied with the present. That's what we do all the time. And that is what is leading us to all kinds of suffering. Because we think too much about the past. The mind goes into memory and fetch about things that happened in the past, that we wish we were like that. We wish we are younger. We wish we have a little bit more hair now as the hair is falling off. As the hair is turning white, we wish it still is black. All the past. And then when we think about the future, it is unknown, it is uncertain, scary, so we become fearful. And then we look around us, everything that is around us, we find, oh, it is not exactly the way I want it. I want to change it, our expectations. Then that again leads to a lot of dissatisfaction. So human beings, we're the only species of animal that regrets the past, is fearful of the future, and is dissatisfied with the present moment. So the second noble truth about the origin of suffering, samudaya, basically how does suffering arise? The Buddha pointed out that it is craving, which leads to renewed existence. Here, by renewed existence, he meant to be reborn again and again, to be reborn life after life, to come back to samsara over and over again. That is really what is the origin of all this suffering, that we are reborn. Now we can free ourselves from the rebirth, then we won't be suffering anymore. So he pointed out that it is this craving that leads to rebirth. And rebirth in samsara is suffering. And this rebirth is accompanied by all kinds of things happening around us that we delight in them and we lust for it, or we want to get rid of things that are unpleasant, seeking delight here and there as a way to solve our problem. Always finding solutions of sensual pleasures, finding gratification in things that we do to make ourselves happier. So we think that indulging in all kinds of sensual pleasures can make us happy. And then that it is this craving for sensual pleasures, and the craving for non-existence, and the craving for continued existence. These are all causes of suffering, the origin of suffering. And he in fact pointed out that this craving for sensual pleasures is what we commonly call lobha. Lobha is the lust and greed for pleasures, things that are pleasurable. And then when we find things that are unpleasant and painful, then we go into this state of dosa. Dosa is to avoid or get rid of things that are unpleasant. Aversion, that is avoiding things that are unpleasant. But aversion doesn't always work. We can't always avoid unpleasant things. And when we can't avoid them, we hate them. So aversion turns into hatred. Just as lusting for something, right? When we begin to get what we lust for, we never have enough. Lust turns to greed. Aversion turns to hatred. And at the same time, craving for continued existence, moha. We have this delusion that when our five senses are working, the panchakanda, the five aggregates are rising, we begin to experience the environment, and we begin to think that there is this self that exists. The existence of a self, the delusion that the self exists. And then we become self-centered. We want to do things to satisfy, please, and gratify the self. That is moha, the delusion of a self-centered existence. That is moha. Let's take a look at these three conditions in a bit more depth. These are called the three unwholesome roots, commonly from the Pali word akusala mula. Mula, actually, a lot of Pali words are the same as Malay, because many Malay words came from Sanskrit. Pali came from Sanskrit. Quite a number of words are common. Mula is one of those. What is mula in Malay? The beginning, the root, right? The beginning of it all. So, kusala actually refers to wholesome, skillful ways. When we learn something useful and we are skillful at it, that is called kusala. Akusala, having the A in front of it, makes the meaning opposite. So akusala means unwholesome, unskillful. So these are the three unwholesome roots. And they lead to this thing called tanha. Now, tanha is often translated as craving. But actually, my teacher explained in a bit more depth. And I hope today I will help to be able to explain that further with a psychological perspective. That tanha is really not just the word craving. It's emotional reaction. Our emotional reaction to pleasures and pain. That is tanha. So tanha is really the emotional reaction. And what kind of reaction? Reaction to pleasurable things, pleasurable, pleasant sensations. That reaction is called lobha, right? And that lobha basically is to lust and greed for pleasures. And this condition is called kama tanha, the craving for sensual pleasures, sensual desires. So the word karma here, K-A-M-A with a single M, not a double M. This is not referring to the action called karma. It's not the action karma. Here karma simply means pleasures. So it's craving for pleasures. So kama tanha is the first condition, craving for pleasures. The second is when we experience unpleasant sensations, what do? We want to avoid it. Aversion. If we can't avoid it, it turns into hatred. So aversion and hatred towards displeasures, unpleasant things, and painful things. That is dosa. And this condition is called vibhava tanha, craving for non-existence. We don't want it to continue. We want to stop it. That's why it's vibhava tanha. Bhava means existence, to exist. V in front of it again turns the meaning opposite, to want to stop it. V here meaning to want to stop this. Vibhava tanha means we don't want it to exist anymore. So when we experience something unpleasant, we want to stop it. We don't want it anymore. We want to get rid of it. So that is vibhava tanha, craving for non-existence, commonly called dosa. And when we experience neutral sensations, it reminds us that there is something going on, that we are experiencing this. That experience itself, we cling on to it. It is these 5 aggregates that we cling on to. And with clinging on to this experience, we then think that there is a self that exists. And we want this self to live forever. We don't want the self to die. Who wants the self to die? Nobody wants that. Everybody wants the self to live on forever. Right? And this craving for continued existence, that is because of this delusion of self-centered existence called moha. And this condition of craving is called bhava tanha. Bhava here means existence. So craving for continued existence. So these are the 3 unwholesome roots that give rise to all our suffering. These are the origins and causes of our suffering. Our emotional reaction to sensations, whether they are pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, our reaction to sensations leads to suffering. Now, if we can sense something without reacting to it, basically we can cultivate peace and calm. We're not reacting. And this is why the Buddha pointed out that the middle way is firstly to learn how to relax, conscious relaxation. And the method to do that is to learn the meditation called samatha. Samatha meditation is the cultivation of tranquility, learning how to relax the body, tame the emotion so that we don't get excited by emotions. That is samatha meditation. So that is basically how we can learn to calm ourselves and not react to any kind of sensations that we experience. Because very often we cling on to our experiences, and this is pointed out by Thich Nhat Hanh. People have a hard time letting go of their suffering. It is out of the fear of unknown, fear of uncertainty, fear of instability, fear of anicca. They prefer suffering that is familiar. And this is because we personalize our experiences. We cling on. The word clinging comes from the Pali word upadana. Upadana means clinging. And sometimes it's translated as grasping. Sometimes it's translated as attachment. But my teacher pointed out, Venerable Dr. Bunaji said, basically, upadana is actually personalization. We personalize every experience and say, this is me, this is mine. That is the personalization process. And that is actually what leads to all this suffering also. The clinging on to these 5 aggregates. So now let's explore the psychological basis for suffering. What gives rise to suffering from the science and psychology? First of all, the Buddha said very clearly, Right? Emotions dominate the world. Emotion create distress. Emotions is the one thing to which all are spellbound. That means when we experience something and we become emotionally aroused, we are trapped. That emotional arousal is what causes us to react in a number of ways. Basically, human beings are creatures of emotions. We react to emotion first. It's after reacting to emotions, only the wise people have a bit of time to think about it and realize that certain things are not wise, certain emotions are not good to indulge in. But for those who are not mindful and not aware of it, we are caught and trapped every time we get emotional. It's very difficult to break out of emotions. I'm going to explain in a scientific way why that is so. Okay. Now, the Buddha, in order to explain that, it's good to understand that Buddha pointed out that there are three parts of mental experience. And it is very important to understand these three words. Because very often when we read Buddhist text, these three words are unfortunately translated generically to the word mind. Now, the word mind is a bit difficult and daunting to understand. If we ask different people, even different scientists, what is the meaning of mind? What is the mind? You will get many different answers, even from the greatest scientists and psychologists and brain scientists. They will give you all kinds of different explanation what is mind. Even monks, sometimes we hear slightly different variations of the meaning of the word mind. But the Buddha was good. He was very precise. He explained that the mind is made of three mental experiences. These are three parts of the mental experience. The first word he used is vijnana. Vijnana basically refers to the arising of a mental image when our sense organs are being stimulated. That means the activity of the panchakanda, the five aggregates. When the five aggregates activates, we have this mental perception of something that we have experienced from the sense organ. And this is vijnana, perception. Right? Some people translate that as consciousness, but it is basically the awareness of something we have seen, heard, smelled, tasted, or touched. The awareness, the mental perception that arises. So that is the first part of mental experience. Arises from what is perceived through our sense organs. Then when that arises, at the same time, there is another process in the mind that tries to interpret that arising. And that the Buddha called mano. Mano is basically what the scientists call the cognitive process, the thinking part of our mind, the ability to interpret what has been perceived. So this part of the mind tries to interpret what has been perceived. And this is a categorized interpretation of perception, trying to give meaning to this perception, giving meaning to what has been perceived, to be able to recognize or recognize what we have seen, heard, smelled, taste, or touch, and give meaning to it. And that is actually our intellectual mind. And the layman's term would be intellect. But the scientists can call this cognitive process, our cognition, the ability to think. That's what it is, the ability to think. And at the same time, whenever we see, hear, smell, taste, or touch anything, there is a sensation of whether it is pleasant or unpleasant. And then there is another part of the mind that reacts to this sensation. And that is what the Buddha called the third part of the mental experience, citta. This is really what the scientists call the affective process. The process that is affected by environmental stimulations. And the common layman term is emotions. Whenever we experience something pleasant or unpleasant feelings, it arouses this emotion, and this arousal leads to this emotional excitement. When we get excited, we have this emotional urge to do something, and then we begin to react. So this emotional excitement and reaction arises because of citta. At the same time, citta is what causes us to cling on to our experience. Clinging on to every experience, personalizing the experience, and begin to believe that, this experience, there is a self to be affected. There is the I and me that is affected. That's why when we think about it, if you wake up in the morning and you walk down the passage, and then you knock your hand against the wall, and then it hurts, what happens? What do we say to ourselves? Oh, my hand hurts. See, my hand hurts. What have we done? My hand. We personalize this to be me, mine, me and mine. Or we see somebody, we see a brother there or a sister there and say, oh, I see you. What have we done? I see you. We created the notion of I. So this notion of the I, me and mine arises with every experience. When you knock your hand against the wall, do you ever say, this hand hurts? No, we don't. My hand hurts, not this hand hurts. Yeah. And if we see somebody there, do we say, these eyes see you? No, I see you. That is that personalization process that is constantly going on. And this has been conditioned. Every time the five aggregates arises, we personalize that experience, clinging on to it. And that's what leads to the suffering. We begin to believe that there is a self to be affected. And when we begin to believe there is a self to be affected, we become self-centered. We begin to want to do things to gratify the self. So basically, the Buddha pointed out that there are these three parts of mental experiences. Unfortunately, many translators of Buddhist texts translating from Pali into English, whenever they see any of these words, especially between mano and citta, they don't differentiate. They don't differentiate whether Buddha was talking about emotional mind or the thinking mind. And they just use the word mind. Right? I'll show you some examples later on. Now, how does that correlate with the brain? Because when we ask people, where is your mind? Where do you think people point? Ooh, up here. That's what people do. What are you pointing at? You're not pointing at your mind. You are pointing at your brains. Your brain is an organ. It exists. It's something there. If you cut up your head, you can feel it, you can touch it. If basically it's something that you can feel and touch. It exists. It is there. But is your mind there? No. Your mind is really the activity of the brain. When the brain is active, between the brain cells, they are exchanging electrical charges, and they are also exchanging chemicals. Well, they call it neurotransmitters. So these electrical charges and chemicals, this electrochemical activity of the brain, that gives rise to this mental process called the mind. So the mind is a mental process. That's why the Buddha pointed out that there are three parts of this mental experience. This mental process is an experience. Right? It gives rise to this thing called experience. Consciousness is an experience. So basically, that part of the brain, the limbic system, is the emotional part of the brain, and that is what the activity that gives rise to this process called the affective process, the emotions. And the cerebral cortex, that part of the brain is the thinking part of the brain, and that gives rise to this cognitive process called mano. So when we think of mano, basically, it is the thinking part of our mind, and when we think of citta, then it is the emotional part of our mind. Right? So basically, that's the differentiation there. And in this emotional brain, deep inside this emotional brain, now in order to understand suffering, we have to understand this part of the brain. Deep inside this emotional brain is that little thing called the amygdala. The amygdala is a little tissue in the brain. When it is aroused, it causes a lot of chain reaction. It is there to protect us from harm. It scans environmental inputs and protect us from harm. It senses for things like bright light, hot surfaces, heat, right? Fast approaching object. Right? All this arouse the emotion and cause a reaction in the body to protect us. We walk down the street, and then suddenly, to the corner of our eye, something is coming towards us very quickly. It could be a truck out of control. It could be a motorbike that jumped out of the road and heading towards us. What do? Do we stop, turn around, take a look and say, what is this? Oh, is it a car? Is it a truck? If it is a truck, if I don't jump out of the way, the truck coming this way is going to run me over and I will die. Maybe it's time for me to jump out of the way. We don't have time to think like that. If we start thinking like that, we will be dead. That's what the amygdala is for. When the amygdala senses fast approaching object, it triggers a stress reaction, a fight or flight reaction that causes the body to react, right? And that reaction helps to save our lives. And this is a kind of a stress reaction, commonly called fight or flight reaction. When something is about to hurt us or harm us, we either try to stop it or fight against it, or we turn around and run away from it. All this is programmed into our instincts. From the early days, if we go back to millions of years, to the days when humans evolved from cavemen, right? So when we were living in caves, two kids will walk down the street. Two kids will walk down the jungle path. And they walk down the jungle path, they will see the bush rattle, they will hear a loud roar. And then a saber-toothed tiger jumps out. And then one of the kids turned around and ran. The other kid was curious. What is this? Saber-toothed tiger? What is this? And then what happens? The saber-toothed tiger eats the guy. And that child would not survive. The one who survived is the one who turned around and ran. So what did he learn? He learned that when you hear a loud roar, it could be danger. And then when you see that saber-toothed tiger, you run. So he learned that this fast approaching object, you turn around and run. So that is a programmed reaction. And the same thing happens to us. We walk down the street, and through the corner of our eye, we hear something coming towards us, rumbling. And then we notice a fast approaching object. Then the natural reaction is to turn around and run. Because the one who survived, and the one who survived gave birth to next generation after generation, we were programmed to turn around and run when something threatening like that happens. So that is what happened in the amygdala. The amygdala is there to protect us with that reaction. So unfortunately, the amygdala has a paradoxical role. That first role is what I have just described to you as the bodyguard. But the amygdala can also be aroused unnecessarily. For example, you're sitting there reading a book quietly, peacefully reading a book, and then your good friend comes from behind you. And without warning, he just touched you on the shoulder. What happens when you are sitting there quietly reading a book and somebody touches you on the shoulder? Your whole body reacts. That reaction is the reaction of the amygdala. And that can cause us a lot of stress in the body. That's why the amygdala can also be a terrorist in your body. If you allow it to be aroused, So if it can be aroused, unnecessarily, then it can become a terrorist in your brain. So that is the paradoxical roles of the amygdala. And it is all this that causes us a lot of suffering. Right? So let's take a look at what the scientists have to say about this, the brain.
As humans have evolved, it's doubled in size. It weighs only 3 pounds, but it consumes 20% of all the fuel our bodies take in, generating enough energy to keep a light bulb burning.
And you have to consider the brain having evolved like an old house, where we just added different rooms. And so there's all these stairways and connections.
In the basement is the oldest part, called the brain stem. It's something we share with reptiles and other mammals. It's what keeps us alive, governing vital functions like heart rate, respiration, digestion, and blood pressure. Things that happen without having to think about them.
The next level up, the first floor, more evolved. Hundreds of thousands of years later, it's called the limbic system. And this is very important in the processing of emotions.
Within the limbic system are the amygdala, 2 nuggets of tissue, 1 in each half of the brain. They are no bigger than a fingernail, yet they are the brain's central command center for our emotional reactions. One of the simplest and strongest of these is fear, a primal emotion we all share.
If you had to pick one brain region that was most important in fear, it would be the amygdala.
What scientists discovered is that as humans evolved, another part of the brain, called the cortex, also became involved in processing fear.
The part that makes us most human about the brain is our frontal cortex.
If the amygdala is the first floor, the cortex is the second floor of the brain. It's the brain's thin, wrinkly outer layer that's divided into 4 sets of lobes.
If you unfolded the cortex of a monkey, it would be about the size of a piece of paper. If you unfolded our cortex, it's about 4 sheets of paper large. And the reason it's wrinkly is because you have to squish that all inside of the skull.
The frontal lobes comprise the area just above our eyes, and these are the newest rooms of the brain. As humans evolved, the frontal lobes became the place where conscious, rational thought is processed. It's where we do our problem solving.
The frontal lobes are so interesting because they are really the conductor of the brain. They synchronize all activity.
Scientists made a major breakthrough in fear research when they found that information from our senses reaches the amygdala almost twice as fast as it takes to get to our frontal lobes. The speed of the different brain signals means unless we instinctively know how to react to a potential threat, we may freeze in fear, waiting for the frontal lobes to catch up to figure out the right response.
Part of what happens with fear and panic is the unknown, is not knowing what to do next, and so your brain essentially freezes the way a deer freezes in the headlight.
So the amygdala may get very fast signals about fear, but sometimes they're wrong, and quickly the situation may say to you, no, it's not a fear situation, and you're not afraid. So these very quick amygdala signals that you get can be controlled in sort of a top-down way.
So she pointed out that these amygdala signals can be controlled in a top-down way. Top-down way means we can actually use our thinking brain to control our emotional brain to some degree if we exercise and practice the use of our thinking brain. But unfortunately, many of us don't do that very well. When faced with difficulties and faced with emotional arousal, we rarely pause, relax, and think before we react. Because the solution, as the Buddha pointed out, is to learn to pause, relax, and then think before you act. And that is really the way to overcome our suffering, to learn how to tame our emotions. So let's take a look at how all that is happening, the process of experience. And when environmental activities stimulate our sense organs, stimulating our eyes, ears, nose, tongue, and body, basically this process of panchakanda arises. And this process of panchakanda, the 5 aggregate, gives rise to this mental experience we call perception. We become aware of something we have just seen, heard, smell, taste, or touch. That gives rise to the experience of seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and touching. That this mental experience arises, and then we begin to interpret what has been seen. So the mano arises to interpret what we have just perceived through our sense organs by comparing it with categorized memory of past experiences. All interpretation is based on our memory of past experiences. We interpret things using our memory. If we remember certain things to be in a certain way, we will interpret that kind of experience based on that memory. So that interpretation process is called papancha, and that is the activity of the mano. At the same time, when there is pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral sensations, the chitta arises. And one of the first things the chitta does is to trigger a biochemical reaction in the body. And that causes tension in the body. And that tension in the body is then felt as some kind of bodily sensations. Right? So that tension is felt as a bodily sensation. Now, we don't realize this. We think that, this is not very normal. No. We are experiencing this every moment of the day without realizing it. The body is reacting to everything we see, hear, smell, taste, and touch. Even to the sound, to a word, to an image, the body reacts. We don't realize that. And I can prove it to you. For some of you who are sensitive, I just have to say one word. I say asam laksa. Some of you will feel sourness in your mouth. So what has happened to you? I've triggered a biochemical reaction in your body. Some of you feel it. Some of you don't. Right? I'm not going to do that. There is another way to make you feel something worse, but never mind. Okay? So basically we hear words and then we begin to feel sensations in the body, and that is going on continuously. And it is this clinging on to this experience that leads to our suffering. And this is really causing some kind of a physiological disturbance called stress. This is the physical suffering, the physical part of our suffering called stress. It's a physiological disturbance to the body, and it causes us to want to fight against it or run away from it, right? To react to it in some ways. So what happens to the body when we experience this kind of stress? See, the brain sends a signal message to various glands in the body, and one of the glands that receive this message is the adrenal gland. It starts to release two very powerful hormones, cortisol and adrenaline. And these two hormones cause the body to react. One of the reactions, the heart beats faster, blood pressure rises to improve our circulation. At the same time, it causes us to breathe deeper. Think about it. When we get emotional, what happens? We usually find ourselves, the heart beating faster. We find our muscles are all tensed up. We find our facial expression all cringed up. Right? Facial expression become distorted. And then we find ourselves really now wanting to fight against something that we don't like, or to run away from it, or if it is something pleasurable, now we want to get more of it. There is this reaction going on. So this is causing a lot of changes in the body. This is very unhealthy. Right? And when all this is happening, this bodily sensation is going on. It arouses, triggers the rising of a mental suffering. And that mental suffering is emotions. Emotions come in two dimensions. The first is what I have already just described to you, the physiological dimension. The other dimension of emotion, psychological, mental suffering. Right? And that mental suffering is made of two parts, arousal and reaction. It gets aroused and when we react. So when we experience these sensations, pleasant or unpleasant sensations, and we feel the body changing, then there is this bodily sensation. We begin to react to it. And the way the chitta reacts to it is to trigger the arising of imagination, memory, and expectation. So this memory, imagination, expectation arises. We begin to think about the past, imagine about the future, and worry about the present. So that is lobha, dosa, moha. If it is something pleasurable, we want more of it. That's lobha. If it is something unpleasant, we want to get rid of it. Dosa. And at the same time, we begin to cling on to the experience, thinking that there is a self being affected by it. That is moha, delusion of self-centered existence. These are emotional excitements. The emotional excitement leads to mental proliferation. The mind begins to run away, imagine all kinds of things. This is why we begin to regret the past, fearful of the future, and dissatisfied with the present. That is caused by this imagination, memory, and expectation, disturbing the thinking mind. The thinking mind cannot think anymore. And this disturbance is very severe. We don't realize it, but it's happening all the time. And this is called distress, domanassa, mental suffering from the imagination, memory, expectation. And this is what I commonly call, imagination, I, memory, M, expectation, E. I call this the I-M-E syndrome. The syndrome where we are self-centered, this self-centeredness, the I, me syndrome, right? The self-centeredness. And this causes this tug-of-war going on in the mind. The mind can't control itself. It begins to go into this tug-of-war, pulling in opposite directions, right? And this pulling in opposite direction is the feeling, the emotions pulling in one direction, and then the reasoning, which is the thinking, pulling in the other direction. Feeling and reasoning pulling in opposite direction. Now when that happens, we usually make decisions according to our feelings. When feelings and reasoning pull in opposite directions, we begin to experience this condition called cognitive dissonance. And when that happens, we invariably react according to feeling. And then when we react according to our emotions, we use our intelligence to justify our reactions. That's what we do. Human beings make decisions with emotions, and then they use the intelligence to justify the decision they make. That's what we do all the time, right? And that is really what is going on in us all the time. Think about it. Many of us enjoy something, but we will always find a reason to explain why we should enjoy it. How many of you, now be honest, how many of you really enjoy durian? And I'm raising my hand. Yeah, see? Now, when we ask you, why do you like durian? There's always 101 explanations. But actually, we know a few important facts. Durian is not a very healthy fruit, true or not? Yeah, because there are substances in durian which can cause ill effects to our good health. And yet, we cannot stop eating durian. We enjoy it so much. So we'll think of ways to explain why durian is good for us. So we enjoy durian because of our emotion. And then we try to explain it with our intelligence, to try to figure out explanation, like saying things like, oh, durian contains a lot of protein, durian contains a lot of fiber, durian has a lot of antioxidant, but actually there are many other fruits that are even better than this. Much cheaper, much better fruits. One of the best fruits has no sugar, no starch, very, very high in antioxidant, more than durian, very high in fiber, far more than durian, costs a fraction the price of a durian, and yet we don't often enjoy it very much. It's called what? Chicken shit fruit. Chicken shit fruit, kai si go. That's the Chinese word for it, kai si go. Guava. And yet, we don't have guava party, right? How many of you throw guava party? And yet very often we hear about durian party. See? Now you realize, having this party, then they come to this explanation. Oh, durian party is very good for fellowship. People get together. See, we're using the intelligence to justify our emotional desire for eating durian. Okay. So, but don't blame yourself. It is in your brain that is causing that. Let's see what the scientists have to say about this condition.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, time!
And when we try to control them, we start a tug of war between our brain's oldest and newest parts. While ancient structures like the amygdala respond to threats by trying to turn our anger or fear on, it's newer structures, such as the prefrontal cortex, the thinking part of our brain, that tried to turn them off. It's the tug of war between these two systems that gives rise to our emotions. At New York University, neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux has studied how the amygdala and the cortex shape our emotional responses. You know more about the amygdala than anybody alive, and you still can't control yours.
No.
Why?
Now, there's an interesting thing, again, that has to do with the wiring of the brain. This is, if we could just look at it here. So this is the human brain inside a skull. And the prefrontal cortex is here in the front, right behind your forehead. And that is the newest part of the brain. This is where we make our decisions. This is where we plan for the future and strategize. The lateral prefrontal cortex has no connectivity with the amygdala. The amygdala has superhighways to talk to the cortex, but the prefrontal cortex has only back roads and side streets to get to the amygdala. And therefore, it is unable to tell the amygdala, cool it.
But why are there no connections?
We're in the process of evolving as we speak, and those connections have not been put in yet. This thing was built to do fancy things cognitively, not necessarily to control our emotions.
The brain is evolved to do fancy things cognitively, not necessarily to control our emotions. Like, what are some of the fancy things cognitively? Things that we invent: computers, cell phone, right? Lighting, fan, aircon. All these are wonderful things we invent. Why? To please our senses, to make our life more pleasurable. That's what it is. So the brain is evolved to invent these things so that it tries to please our senses, make ourselves enjoy life more. That's what it is. All these inventions are there to help us enjoy life more. Now, you heard the scientists explain there, from the amygdala, there are very strong connections going to the thinking brain. And from the thinking brain, there are very weak connections going back to the amygdala. And that's what it is. It is this strong connections going to the thinking brain that is continuously disturbing our rational thinking when our emotions are aroused. This is why when emotions are aroused, it's very difficult to tame the emotion. We can't stop the emotion right away. We can't stop it. But what can we do? We can learn to relax, learn to cultivate calmness. When something arouses our emotion, makes us feel excited, emotionally excited, just learn to pause. Don't react right away. Just relax. Take a deep breath. And it is this relaxation that can help us respond better to our environment. Because if we don't, it will actually lead us to a lot of suffering, self-affliction of mental suffering. And the Buddha pointed out in the Dhammapada verse number 42. Whatever harm one enemy may do to another, or one hater may do to another, one's ill-directed emotions inflict upon oneself a greater harm. It's the way we interpret things and react to our emotional interpretation. And this emotional interpretation arises because of mental proliferation coming from our imagination, our memory, and our expectation. The I, me syndrome. So, but there is a way to end all this, and that's what the Buddha pointed out as the third noble truth, that there is an end to suffering, nirodha, meaning cessation. It is the remainderless fading away and cessation of that same craving, the giving up and relinquishing of that, and freedom from it. Giving up, relinquishing, abandoning it. When these things arise, when this craving arises, learn to let it go. Learn not to cling on to it. Just let go by relaxing. And before we react, then we can gain freedom from it. And we will not be dependent on it, non-reliant on it. And basically this is the third noble truth, that there is an end to this suffering if we can learn how to calm ourselves and not cling on to it. Then we can become free from it. And how? So that is the fourth noble truth, the way leading to the cessation of suffering. And the Buddha pointed out it is this Sublime Eightfold Way. Ariya Atangika Marga. Atangika means there are eight parts of it. Ariya is this sublime, supernormal, above normal. Sublime Eightfold Way. Marga is the way. So these are the eightfold ways that the Buddha explained. So I'm not going to go into this detail because the detail of the eightfold way you can find in many books. You can attend many talks. So my sharing here is a very unique one, basically explaining to you the psychological perspective of this eightfold way. So these are the eightfold way that the Buddha taught about. I'll just briefly touch on that later on. So this is basically the way leading to the cessation of suffering, the eightfold way. So if we were to then take a look at what the Buddha actually taught in summary, he pointed out the first part is to abandon all evil ways. That is, when we get aroused, when we get excited, we find something pleasurable, we want more of it, right? So we have to learn how to let it go, abandon. The word is abandon. Some of you may have come across a slightly different translation in this Dhammapada verse number 183. Instead of abandon all evil ways, you may come across this thing called avoid evil. Avoid evil is fine, but actually if you think about it, you can't avoid it. Because when it arises in you, it's already arising in you. That desire to want something pleasurable. Or when something is unpleasant, you really don't want it. Now, you can't avoid this arising. This emotional state you cannot avoid. But what can you do? You can learn to abandon it. Let it go. That's why abandon is a more precise explanation of what that means. When you get emotionally excited, whether to want more of something pleasurable or want to get rid of something unpleasant, learn to let go, learn to relax, abandon that emotional urge. That's why abandon all evil ways is a more precise explanation. And when you do that, then you are learning not to harm yourself. Because when you abandon, you're not giving in to your emotions, so you're not harming yourself. And at the same time, you're not reacting to anger towards other people. You're also not harming other people. So the important thing about abandoning evil ways is to learn not to harm self and not to harm other beings. And then the second part, enter the good life. Very often you come across a slightly different translation on this. Another translation is called do good. Now, doing good is just an effort you do from time to time. But what the Buddha really meant is not just to do good from time to time. He actually meant change your life, reorientate your life. Enter the good life is to practice a change in your lifestyle so that you can bring wellness, peace, harmony, and happiness to yourself and the people around you, to all beings. It's not just about yourself, it's also about the people around you. So, enter the good life is a more precise explanation of what the Buddha taught. To learn how to reorientate your life into a life of wholesomeness and goodness. And finally, to purify one's mind. Basically, the Buddha taught that we've got to learn how to cultivate tranquility. And when we are able to cultivate tranquility, we will gain mental equilibrium, samadhi. And from there, we can then cultivate true knowledge, direct knowledge, panya, by the practice of vipassana meditation, to attain insight into realities. And that is really how we can purify our mind, only through meditation. This part, purify one's mind, has a lot to do with meditation. Of course, it has to do with other things, but meditation is one of the practices that can help you purify your mind, because it can help you cultivate tranquility. It can help you cultivate to attain insight into realities. Samatha meditation and vipassana meditation. And basically, this is what the Buddha taught to be his experiential realities. So we got to learn how to do it according to what we have learned and understood from the teachings of the Buddha. And again, I want to point out that very often when people talk about the teachings of the Buddha, they translate the word mano or chitta to the word mind, and the word mind becomes a little bit confusing. This phrase is the very first verse of Dhammapada. Very often, all of you would have come across a translation that says, mind precedes our mental states. Mind dominates. Mind creates our experiences. So the word mind is not really very precise. What did the Buddha mean? The Buddha was referring to mano. Mano is the thinking part of your mind, the conscious, rational thinking mind, your intellect. And that's what the Buddha was referring to. By the use of your intellect, to learn and understand what is the Dharma and to practice it using your intellect, having understood it, you now practice it, that will lead to your happiness. Because it creates all your experiences, it actually dominates your life, it will help create your realities. So it is only through your conscious mind that you can create realities that lead to wellness, peace, and happiness. Because if we're not, we are then subject to emotions. And it has always been said that Buddhism is really a humanistic religion. The Buddha went out to seek this humanistic solution. So what does the word humanistic mean? Well, humanistic is actually a very powerful word, because there are two kinds of religions. There are theistic religions and humanistic religions. Theistic religions evolve around God, from the word theology. Theistic comes from the word theology. Theo means God. So those are God-based religion. You do it because that's what the God commanded you to do. You are God-fearing. You do it because you fear God. Right? So you allow God's will to dominate your life. God's will dominates your life. That is God-based religion. Buddhism is not one of those religions. Buddhism is a humanistic religion. So what does humanistic mean? Well, this is the translation. This is actually the explanation of the meaning of the term humanistic from the American dictionary Merriam-Webster. It says, it is a doctrine, attitude, or way of life centered on human interests or human values, especially a philosophy that usually rejects supernaturalism, and all this blind faith and supernatural beliefs in heavenly powers, rejects supernaturalism and stresses on individuals' dignity and worth and capacity for self-realization through reason. And that is precisely what the Buddha did. He realized it from himself by meditating under the Bodhi tree, finally until he realized the reality of life, that he had discovered actually what is really going on. So it was this self-realization through reason. Very important. We're going to learn to do it for ourselves. Practice it and learn to do it. This is why it's called the Sublime Eightfold Way, and not just the path. It's not about the road. It's about the journey. It's about how we take the journey, the way we practice. So this is really the humanistic practice. By realizing what is good for us, what is through our reason, then we practice it. Because of human interests, human values. Not because of supernatural beings. Not because of God commandments. Right? So that's what leads to the Buddha's awakening. The solution is the awakening of Buddhahood. To gain freedom from all suffering, which is Nibbana. And that's what the Buddha has accomplished. This is the supreme accomplishment of the Buddha, the harmoniously awakened one, where he pointed out that there are 3 stages to this awakening: Sila, Samadhi, and Panya. So, Sila, Samadhi, and Panya are found in the Eightfold Way. The way the Buddha taught the Eightfold Way, he has pointed out, first, we learn and understand the Buddha Dharma, right view. And then we orientate our life, harmonious orientation. We reorientate our life to do good, to think good, right? To speak good. This is the initial level of wisdom, the basic level of wisdom that leads us to practice the Dharma by understanding what it means, how it can help us. That is self-realization by reasoning. Okay? Having understood that, then we begin to tame the body. We begin to cultivate the body. Cultivating the body comes in the next part called Sila. Sila is cultivation of morality, good morality, through harmonious speech, or right speech, right action, and right livelihood. Living our life in accordance with what is good and what is wholesome. That is cultivating the whole body, right? Then having cultivated the whole body, or while cultivating this whole body, we can then begin to cultivate the mind and purify the mind. And that comes the last part there, where this part is called the Samadhi part, tranquility, where we begin to learn meditation and diligently practice meditation through right effort, right mindfulness, and what is commonly translated as right concentration, but my teacher pointed out the more correct translation is harmonious equilibrium, not just concentration. So it's basically about bringing the mind to a level of mental equilibrium, tranquility of mind. So this is really that part called Samadhi. This is what this Eightfold Way can help us. By learning, understanding what it is, and then realizing how it can help us, how to practice it, then when we put it into our life, reorientate our life and do it, then we will begin to realize the benefit from it. Now, this is a traditional way of looking at the way we can gain benefits from our understanding of realities of life. This is a very common one used in the Western world, developed by a psychologist by the name of Abraham Maslow. He described this as the hierarchy of needs. At the lowest level, what do humans seek? What do humans want to do for themselves? At the most minimum, lowest level, when we don't have everything else, we just want to stay alive. This is called self-preservation. We do things to stay alive. We seek food, we seek shelter, right? And that helps us to stay alive. When we're able to stay alive, what do we do next? Then we try to protect ourselves from harm, protect ourselves from danger. That is aversion from danger, aversion from harm, danger aversion. That is the second level, second tier there. We protect ourselves, secure ourselves, make ourselves comfortable and not be subject to harmful conditions. When we reach that stage, what else do we want? The next thing we want is relationships. We also then want to have children. We want to reproduce. So reproduction and society. That is the third level as we traverse up the hierarchy of needs. Now, when we now have family and friends, we have comfortable living, what else do we want? We want to do things. We want to accomplish goals. Goal seeking. We are naturally goal seeking when all these conditions are met. And that is the level of esteem. That is where we begin to honor what the self can do. I can do this. I can achieve that. And that is where the ego comes in. Now, ego is not all bad. Ego helps us become successful in real life. Without ego, we will be living a very boring life. Everything, no ego. Anything also can. Then we're not going to be successful. We will never get a better job. We will not want to get promotions in our job. We will not want to earn more so that we can actually get more and make ourselves more comfortable. So ego is not necessarily all bad, but it is too much of ego. Then that makes it bad. So when we have some ego, it can help us become more successful. Now we become successful and capable. What do we want next? The next thing we look for is this higher self, this actualization. We begin to seek spiritual awakening. But that is what the Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs ends in. That's all it ends in. And this is about our normal day-to-day conventional living. But the Buddha taught us there is one more thing above that. One more layer above that. And that is transcendence, going beyond worldly things, going beyond worldly limitations, to learn how to transcend from this world we call samsara. Okay, to go beyond that. And that is what the Buddha has pointed out. There is a way. And it is this eightfold way that can help us transcend beyond that level. Right. So that is what the Buddha has done with this eightfold way. It is basically the last part helping us to transcend is to purify one's mind. This helps us to awaken beyond our worldly limitations to the awakening of humans' boundless potential. That's why the Buddha is the awakened one. Actually, the word Buddha came from the word Bodh. Bodh actually in Sanskrit simply means to awaken from a dream. Bodh. That's why the Buddha is the awakened one. The word Buddha is actually, it's not a title. It is not a name given to him. It's basically a description of what he has accomplished. The Buddha is the awakened one, the one who has awakened from the dream of existence. And that's why when he meditated under that tree, it was just a fig tree. And when he became awakened and became the Buddha, they renamed the tree the Bodhi tree. The word Bodhi came from the word Bodh. And in fact, that Bodhi tree was located in a small part of a small town called Gaya. Now you know. They renamed that town Bodh Gaya. So now you know how it all came about. Bodh Gaya, Bodhi tree, the Buddha. And he was the awakened one.
There is a story of a Brahmin who one day found the Buddha under a tree, calmly meditating. The Buddha's mind was still. He radiated such power and strength that the Brahmin was reminded of a tusker elephant. The Brahmin asked him who he was. Imagine a lotus that had begun life underwater, the Buddha replied. But grew and rose above the surface until it stood free. So I too have transcended the world and attained the supreme enlightenment. Who are you then? The Brahmin wondered. Remember me, the Buddha said, as the one who woke up.
So the Buddha is the awakened one, awakened from samsara. Just as the lotus born in the water, grown up in the water, rises above the water and remains unsoiled by the water, so is the Buddha. Though born in the world, grown up in the world, rises above the world, he remains unsoiled by the world. He has become the awakened one. Thank you very much. That is the end of my presentation. I hope this has been useful. I hope it has given you a new perspective to the Sublime Eightfold Way. And if you want the details about this Eightfold Way, of course you can read it in many books. So that's not what what I was trying to explain. But I hope this explanation from a psychological perspective has been helpful. Thank you very much.